researchers for a number of years. So we'll talk about that. And I know it may be a hard topic for some people to wrap their heads around, but hopefully we can at least have an open discussion about it. So as I mentioned, I'm a filmmaker. I like to hike and travel and adventure, look for the unknown, including cryptozoology. I've hiked all 48 of the 4,000 footers in my home state of New Hampshire, and I love the state of New Hampshire and just hiking in general. So just a couple of films that I've done over the years. One of my really first attempts at cryptozoology was Mystery at Loch Ness in 2016, which I did after I visited the famous Loch Ness, home to Nessie, one of the most famous cryptids in the world, of course. Also done a documentary miniseries on the Lake Champlain monster known as Champ in Vermont, which is a beautiful, beautiful lake on the borders of Vermont and New York, upstate New York. And that series was with Small Town Monsters, which is an independent production company I now work heavily with, who focuses primarily on small town folklore, including many cryptid and paranormal mysteries across the United States, like Mothman and the Rougarou of Louisiana, of course, all the Bigfoot mysteries around the country as well, and many other topics. In 2018, I collaborated with a late friend of mine who was really big into comics, Michael Mitchell, and we did a comic book called The Granite State Bigfoot, where basically we talked about a lot of the sightings in New Hampshire from the 1970s and put it into comic book form. It was a lot of fun working on something like that. I'd never really done a comic book before. In 2020, I released a documentary, early 2020, right before the pandemic. Actually, I released a documentary called Lions of the East, which is about the mountain lion mystery in New England. People talk about seeing mountain lions quite a bit. Spent about 2 years working on this project, talking to people in various states, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, and talking to amateur researchers, investigators, state officials like game wardens, New Hampshire Fish and Game in particular, environmental police, and lots of other folks, eyewitnesses as well, of course. In 2020, I also worked on a series called Chasing Legends, where we went around the country looking for various cryptid mysteries, including a Bigfoot-like creature in Arizona, known as the Mogollon Monster, also the Lake Champlain Monster, the Pukwudgies of Massachusetts in the fabled Bridgewater Triangle, and the Rougarou of Louisiana, which is a sort of Cajun werewolf mystery. And that series can be seen on YouTube. Since then, with Small Town Monsters, we've been working on a series called On the Trail of Bigfoot that has been, films that are basically put out about particular areas. We did On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey, which is about upstate New York and the Adirondacks. And coming next month in November, actually is On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Discovery, with a group in Washington State, which has found these unusual nests in their part of the Olympic Peninsula, which has the highest density of Sasquatch reports in the country. These bizarre nests were discovered in 2016, and they've been studying them for a few years. And primatologists have actually looked at these nests and said, this is the kind of stuff they expect to see in Africa with gorillas. Yet in this case, it's purported Bigfoot habitat. So it's very interesting. That film will be coming out, as I mentioned, in November. And recently, very heavily this past year, we've been working on a series called Beyond the Trail, also with Small Town Monsters, which is on YouTube. We actually just released an episode today about Rocky Mountain Sasquatch, so Bigfoot in Colorado. The first episode, which was called The Granite State Bigfoot Case, is about New Hampshire. That came out in May, and they've kind of been monthly since then. We have Sasquatch in the Pine Tree State, about Bigfoot in Maine. We also released Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, about the famous Patterson-Gimlin film in Northern California, and Bigfoot Mountain, which takes place in Oregon. And we have other episodes coming up. So we have our hands full with these sorts of things. I have a YouTube channel called Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. If you want to check that out, go feel free to subscribe. I do videos on there, and I also do a weekly live stream program Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, talking to a variety of cryptozoology researchers, Bigfoot researchers, outdoorsmen, basically anybody who's interested in Sasquatch or otherwise. And we try to have an open dialogue and interact with the audience. And I think with this topic, it's important to have conversations and talk about people's experiences, especially. So cryptozoology is essentially the study of hidden or unknown animals. There's the typical cryptids like Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, Champ of Lake Champlain, things like Mothman, which are a little bit more outlandish perhaps. But then you have out of place animals, mountain lions, previously thought extinct creatures like the thylacine, Tasmanian tiger, which some believe is still alive. So you have former cryptids. These are animals that were not believed to be, they're thought to be folkloric, such as the mountain gorilla, the okapi, which is a half zebra, half giraffe sort of creature, the giant squid, there's stories of the kraken for centuries, and the coelacanth, which was basically, there was no fossil record of it At the time, there was millions and millions of years ago, and they actually found live specimens. So the fossil record sort of dropped off 60 million years, and then they were still alive. So these are all technically former cryptids. Of course, cryptozoology has a lot of folkloric and mythological aspects to it. Most of these creatures are folkloric in nature. So there are attempts for people and various people groups to try and explain things that maybe they don't understand, or creatures they don't understand, such as that map up at the top, which depicts various sea creatures around Iceland. Most of those are actually ones that we know about now, but you can see how they were depicted in the past as they didn't understand what narwhals and seahorses were, so they became these horrific, swarthy monsters. And you have the dragon, of course, the woodwoes, which is a kind of Bigfoot-like creature depicted throughout medieval folklore, especially in Europe. Of course, the werewolf, quintessential sort of folkloric monster. That image towards the bottom left there is Beast of Gévaudan in France, one of the most famous werewolf cases. Kind of my approach, just really quickly, is boots on the ground. So when we're talking about cryptozoological creatures, especially Bigfoot, we'll keep it to Bigfoot. This can apply to any of the other creatures as well, but especially something like Bigfoot, where we think that there actually is not just a folkloric element to it. There may actually be a real creature, an undiscovered animal that is the origin of a lot of the eyewitness accounts. So visiting the region, talking to locals, especially people that know the area, that have grown up in the area, that whether they're hunters or woodsmen, even skeptics, people that might not believe in this, you want to get a very rounded approach to when you're looking at these topics. So you want to let the interviewees tell their stories. Do not ask leading questions. I just want them to tell me exactly what they had happen. I don't want to say something that I've learned from another eyewitness. Oh, well, did you notice this on it? And then that's sort of a leading question. No, we want to get their full story, whatever it is that they saw. And critical thinking, I think, is very important. Most things out there that you find are probably not Bigfoot related. Vast majority. You have to be careful for the pitfall of confirmation bias. And if you're out in the woods and you have a Bigfoot filter on, Bigfoot on the brain, oh, that weird stick structure must have been Bigfoot, but how can you possibly come to that conclusion unless you actually saw it happen? Even then, you'd have to question yourself. So we try to be very rational. There's a lot of wild characters in the Bigfoot field and crazy theories. So I think we're trying to kind of create a little bit more of a refreshing atmosphere where not everything is Bigfoot. We try to be as skeptical and critical as possible, while also open-minded to the possibilities. And documentaries, of course, serve as a great way to preserve these stories, local folklore and history, as well as an educational tool. If there are people having strange sightings and maybe they're kind of traumatized by these experiences, maybe having the awareness that there might be something like this out there may prevent further instances of people kind of being traumatized. I've spoken to people who definitely have some PTSD from their encounters of something that is not supposed to exist, and they're out there in the woods in a vulnerable state, and they see this thing that they simply cannot explain. And a lot of times it's like with many other traumatic experiences. So just a little bit on the origins of Bigfoot. You have strange stories. It's universal throughout human culture. Stories of hominids, strange hairy man-like beasts that live off in the woods or in the deep, dark recesses right outside of civilization or on the edges of civilization. So you have this kind of picture of a medieval knight actually battling one of these woodwoes type depictions in somewhere in Europe in the medieval times. So it's very interesting to see imagery like that, which predates the modern notion of Bigfoot by hundreds of years. As I mentioned, when we're talking about Europe specifically, where a lot of this folklore is, you have, of course, Western Europe, the woodwoes, and Eastern Europe, which is very interesting. My family is originally from the Balkans, and there are strange stories of Wildman. And once you get into Russia and the Caucasus, which have actually been a hotbed of human evolution, they've discovered various Neanderthal offshoots, Denisovans, and hominid species in that area. You have stories of the Almas and the Almasti, Wildman, interacting with villagers, sometimes seen with tools, with clothing even, maybe surviving remnants of Neanderthals that lived past their supposed extinction. In Asia, of course, you have the quintessential abominable snowman, aka the Yeti in the Himalayas, which is described as this sort of white hair-colored creature, but actually is usually brown or black in color. So just like many of the Bigfoot reports in North America. And these are some fairly old pieces of artwork depicting these creatures. You have the rock apes of Vietnam. Actually, American GIs over there during the Vietnam War reported running into these man-sized ape-like creatures that would throw rocks at them in the woods, thinking that those were enemy combatants. The Hibagon in Japan. So there's a long history of this. And I think one of the most interesting aspects is when you look at a place like Australia as well. You have the Yowie and the Wildman. And Australia, of course, is a continent that's been separated from Asia and that part of the world for quite a while. So marsupials have really become sort of like kangaroos, almost like deer there. So you still have that the mystery of the very wild places in Australia. I mean, it's an entire continent to itself. And then you get to the North American continent, where you have the American Indians and the indigenous peoples with very many stories of strange, wild, man-like creatures, including the Tsetsibaba that the Abenaki of this area would have called these creatures, or at least the way they depicted it, the Oma in Northern California, the Junqua out in British Columbia. And then we get into the really interesting depictions of artwork, cultural artwork. So on the left there, you have an image from upstate New York, the Iroquois Nation, and their sort of depiction of these stone giant creatures that clearly differ from their own sort of people in their stature and both in appearance. And then on the right, you have a costume from one of the coastal tribes in British Columbia that it looks very similar to a modern Bigfoot costume that you might have. And this is a traditional costume used for hundreds of years to describe, the hairy people of the woods that they sort of viewed as a separate tribe that was an offshoot. This is Native American petroglyph art from California in the Sierra Nevada mountains, actually brought forward by a cultural anthropologist who works with the Forest Service out there named Kathy Strain, who's written a great book about Native American stories regarding Bigfoot. And she brought this forward with permission of the tribe a number of years ago, befriending them and hearing a lot of their stories and folklore related to hairy men in the woods, kind of a very big part of their culture. And then, of course, these masks, which are very fascinating, mostly from those coastal tribes in British Columbia, depicting almost ape-like features and behavior with the baring of the teeth. That's something that chimpanzees will do when agitated. And, how these tribes in very remote parts of North America had any grasp on what ape behavior was like hundreds of years before we even knew about any modern ape behavior. It's very interesting, something that's completely intriguing, and I think goes under the radar quite a bit. And then, of course, with the colonization of North America, you have a lot of strange stories. Daniel Boone told the story of killing a 10-foot hairy giant called a Yahoo in Kentucky. And Kentucky to this day has a long history of Bigfoot reports. Teddy Roosevelt was a big hunter, conservationist. He was told a story of men killed by a strange creature while hunting. There's, of course, the famous mining cabin attack in Mount St. Helens in Washington in 1924, known as Ape Canyon, still called that to this day. One of my good friends, Mark Marcel, has investigated that report quite a bit and has discovered actually where the origins of that cabin was, and has spoken to relatives of the original miners who were terrorized by these things that were throwing kind of rocks at them and shot at them. And it's a very interesting story. I mean, more than we have time for tonight. The Albert Osmond story is a good one as well, where a lumberjack claimed he was abducted by a family of these creatures and described very interesting family structures and behaviors inhibited or presented by these creatures that he claimed to encounter. You have many newspaper reports from well before the 1950s, when Bigfoot came around, of ape men 8 feet tall with hairy bodies seen in the Rocky Mountains, or wild man startles people in Kentucky. And of course, we have to remember journalism at the time. There was yellow journalism. There was a lot of it was geared towards just selling newspapers. So maybe some of the elements aren't as true. Also, a lot of these Wildman stories may be kind of feral humans or people that were castigated from society. Unfortunately, mental health was not really something that people viewed at the time. They didn't know how to deal with it. So a lot of times, if people maybe had some sort of a mental insufficiency, they were cast out of society. Maybe they lived off in the woods and they were described as a wild man, and very unfortunate. But I think that explains part of it, but not all of it, because once you get into the awareness of gorillas, people start describing gorillas. You have gorilla attacks, Gettysburg resident in Pennsylvania. You have the Durham gorilla in Maine. Various stories, people describing an upright gorilla. And I'll get to a very interesting one I found out about recently in New Hampshire in a little bit here. You have the Winstead Wildman of Connecticut, which was basically thought to be a bear that was prowling, looking around for blueberries, and turned out to be some sort of a man-like creature that stood up and walked away. And there was a classic sort of monster movie hunt where the locals were all armed and trying to find this wild man, which is a pretty common motif, the sort of armed posse. A lot of these stories. When you get into the word Sasquatch, which predates Bigfoot, this is from Canada. It's an anglicized term taken from those coastal Salish tribes, Saskets. J.W. Burns, I believe, was a missionary who actually kind of coined the term Sasquatch. And before, it was depicted almost as if it was a separate tribe, almost caveman-like, living off in the woods, not so much like the modern descriptions of Bigfoot. Of course, the abominable snowman, the Yeti, was a very popular thing in the 1950s and post-World War II. Expeditions to the Himalayas to try and find the Yeti, funded by millionaires such as Tom Slick and others. And supposedly, evidence like this skull cap of a Yeti in the hand and the famous Eric Shipton footprint. Then when you get into Bigfoot, that was actually in the 1950s in Northern California, 1958, construction crews or logging crews up there found these strange tracks and coined it, and journalist coined it Bigfoot. That was sort of the term it was named. And that's actually where the film I mentioned at the beginning, Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, we went to the spot where this happened, where later in 1967, the famous Patterson-Gimlin film was taken of this creature seen walking, which is, of course, depicted right here. Very interesting piece of footage. It's very remote to this day, a very dangerous place to go. It's still one of the most remote areas in the Pacific Northwest, which is really interesting. And of course, Bigfoot and Sasquatch has become a pop culture icon, partially because there's no copyright. Bigfoot is no Mickey Mouse. There's no Disney copyright on Bigfoot, so anyone can use it. It's been used as an Olympic mascot in Canada. It's in video games. You've got films, Harry and the Hendersons, lots of kids' movies. Of course, everyone knows Bumble from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, mascots, beef jerky salesman. Bigfoot is everywhere. You can find him in political campaign ads all over the place. Very interesting cultural kind of phenomenon. Now, various theories about this. You have Giganopithecus, which was the largest ape known to live in history in kind of Southeast Asia. The only fossil evidence we have that it existed were a few thousand teeth and parts of a jawbone that were discovered in Chinese apothecary shops in the 1930s and 40s. So some people think that maybe these creatures survived and are the remnants of what is now the Yeti, maybe migrated to North America. We also got other theories of relict hominids such as Paranthropus, Neanderthal, other creatures that would have been found more on the Homo genus. So lots of different, kind of things that could have been. Australopithecus, of course, has a long history. We're learning constantly new things about human evolutionary tree. And this is where I think a lot of modern researchers are leaning more towards this being clearly the foot structure of the Sasquatch and the footprints that have been found much more resemble humans and something bipedal than it would the other apes that are alive, so gorillas, chimps, and orangutans. Of course, you've got the people who have the paranormal theories that Bigfoot are interdimensional or they're aliens, associated with aliens, ghosts, all this kind of stuff. And I think this has mostly come up in the past few years because of the prevalence of reality television, as well as a lot of the ghost hunting and UFO shows that sort of like to tack onto Bigfoot topics, ancient aliens, that kind of stuff. I think a lot of the serious researchers don't really typically look this direction. And I'm not trying to knock anyone who's looking into this. I just think those of us that are more looking for a biological creature don't necessarily, this doesn't kind of fit that perspective. Of course, hoaxes, there are plenty of fakeries and you can't trust anything you see on the internet. So things you might see online are just simply, you can't trust them. And there's been hoaxes like the 2008 Georgia Bigfoot hoax shown up there in the corner, and then fake feet and stompers. But all it takes is one Bigfoot sighting to be real for there to be something behind it. So I think this is certainly a factor. There's definitely hoaxes. There's also misidentifications. Probably a large number of sightings are misidentifications. People are not out in the woods as they used to be 100, 200 years ago. Our ancestors lived much more in tune to the land than we do today. We're getting further and further away. So people see something weird in the woods and maybe they've got Bigfoot in the brain. Oh, it's Bigfoot. So misidentifications do definitely play a role in it. But some of the sightings that are so clear and daylight or within a few feet, it's very hard, especially if somebody's lived in the woods their whole lives, to say they misidentified a bear when they had this creature in front of them. So definitely something to consider, though. Now, something just interesting before we get into New Hampshire section, which is probably my favorite, but this is a map of kind of proposed sightings throughout North America. And I want you to pay attention to the clusters there, because I'm going to bring up a couple other maps and show a comparison. So this is average precipitation across the United States. So you see the pattern, the eastern part, this is where mostly it's green. You have the Appalachian Mountains, of course, down in the south with the swamps, very green. Drops off rapidly in the Midwest with, the cornfields and kind of the interior, the deserts, of course. And then look up in the left corner there, the Pacific Northwest. It has the most amount of precipitation. That's actually where you have the temperate rainforests of Washington, Oregon, California, up into British Columbia and Alaska. And this is forestation rates in the United States. So again, the eastern states, Maine is number one most forested state in the country, as well as New Hampshire number two. So there's a lot of woodlands. So if we put all these maps together, especially the sightings map and the precipitation map, you see the way the sightings almost drop off perfectly in line with that precipitation map, and the Pacific Northwest has the bulk of sightings. Primates, particularly gorillas and chimps and orangutans especially, but lesser primates such as monkeys and other gibbons and other creatures as well, they need a certain amount of precipitation to live. They live in forested and wooded areas. I mean, in those cases, jungles. But in North America, what are the closest environments to that sort of thing? You have these temperate rainforests. You have the swamplands in the south. Look at Florida. I mean, which is basically a tropical area where you have all sorts of critters can live there. And then the Appalachians, you have that. It's very interesting how it corresponds. You don't have Bigfoot sightings in Brooklyn, or they're not as present in the Dakotas as they are in Ohio or upstate New York. So that's just something very interesting. And of course, there are lots of regional names, and this is just a small list of some of the names that predate the Bigfoot name, because now, when you talk about these creatures, they're universally called Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but there's lots of stories that predate that, because, in the 1920s, they didn't have something to call Bigfoot, so they called it a local thing, such as the Durham gorilla or the Mogollon monster, the beast of Whitehall, the boogers, that's what they call them a lot down south, the Honey Island swamp monster, a lot of different names. We get into New Hampshire, and this is obviously an area near and dear to me as a New Hampshire guy. I've lived here since I was a kid, and I love the Granite State, as I mentioned, hiking and traversing it. And this is actually a pretty cool wood cutting up near the Canadian border in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire. Came across this a number of years ago, and I was just camping up in Cohoes County just this past weekend, doing some solo camping up there, and it's always fun to see that statue up there. So my database, I've been collecting sightings now for a few years, and I've done this Granite State Bigfoot talk quite a number of times since about 2017, 2018, maybe about 7 or 8 times at this point. And I've updated every time, and you're actually going to be hearing a lot of new data and new sightings that I've received over just the past few months. I mean, I'm almost updating my database weekly, but I have a total of 59 reports from New Hampshire, 19 of which come from YouTube comments, which I'm still kind of following up on. They come on a lot of the videos that I post and videos that we've made. That's oftentimes when people watch a video about Bigfoot, say in New Hampshire, they'll come and say, well, I had no idea these things were here. I saw one in the 80s, and I just assumed they were kind of in Washington. I didn't even think it was Bigfoot, that sort of thing. So this is just kind of a breakdown of some of my sightings that I have. And it's pretty interesting. And I'm going to read directly from a few of the sighting reports in a little bit here. I've got a friend of mine who's an awesome independent researcher, wishes to remain anonymous. Not everyone wants to be public with this kind of research, because it can certainly be career damaging, socially damaging. People laugh at you, oh, haha, Bigfoot. But he's a great guy. He has gathered 61 reports from New Hampshire that differ from mine. There are usually reports that he is told about in person or gets emailed his way. And I've read some of them. They're pretty interesting, especially once you start looking at patterns. And eyewitness reports, unfortunately, anecdotal evidence is what it is. It is permissible in a court of law, but when it comes to this topic, the hard evidence is really what's needed for scientific verification. So footprints, fecal matter or scat, hair samples, ultimately a body is probably what's going to be needed, unfortunately. But anecdotal sightings serve the purpose of not only being able to show patterns over time. If you have a lot of data, well, hey, the rock throwing thing seems to be pretty common. Oh, some percentage of reports show smell. People talk about smell. Well, we know that gorillas can actually control their scent glands when angry or agitated. And you have, in Florida, they call it the skunk ape. Now, is that because it lives in an environment that is just inherently very smelly, swampy, dingy? Could be, but about 30-40% of reports across the country report a very putrid smell. People have described it a gorilla house, zoo smell, rotting meat, wet dog. Putrid smell that is lingers often in the air, and again, gorillas can control their body odor basically when angry or agitated. So it's interesting, you have these ape behaviors that have been reported in North America for hundreds of years, and that's where anecdotal sightings come in handy in one hand. The other hand is, let's say you get a fresh sighting and you're able to get to that location within a few days of when it happened and maybe find some secondary evidence. So a footprint or something that might have happened in the area that say, hey, this wasn't just a wild story. There's actually something that was left there. So it's very important to follow up with that kind of stuff. Then these are some reports that were submitted to the BFRO, which is the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, one of the largest national kind of Bigfoot research groups. They have 263 reports for New Hampshire. And one of the researchers, Crystal Panic, she works with them. She's kind of their New Hampshire researcher. She says, I'm currently working about 30 cases. I need to finish on closing a bunch. I do have a backlog I'm currently working on as well. A large number of reports that come in were obvious hoaxes, jokes, or assumed hoaxes, and those are closed out right away. So there's a follow-up process. You know, you go in and look at these sightings and say, all right, well, was this credible? If you're able to talk to the person and kind of see if they're trustworthy, or what do they have anything to gain or lose by telling you the sighting? When the show Finding Bigfoot was on air, the president of the BFRO, Matt Moneymaker, was on the show, and of course, a lot of people are trying to get on TV with their reports, but you have to kind of sort of weed out when you're looking into these reports. And the more secretive somebody's about the sighting, the more credible it usually is they don't want anything to do with it. Maybe they'll tell you once when they trust you, but they don't want to be filmed or recorded or anything like that. And they'll, I've run into that time and time again in New Hampshire, especially. The culture just isn't here for talking about this openly as it is in Washington or California. You go down the street, hey, you believe in Bigfoot? Yeah, my cousin saw one, up on whatever. It's very culturally present in places like that, whereas in New England, it's just not the case. We're hoping to change that and create more of an open atmosphere. And I think there's more of an awareness because a lot of people have been holding these sightings in for a long, long time. This is just a map that Crystal has put together showing some of the sightings across New Hampshire. There's really no pattern to it. New Hampshire, as I mentioned, the second most wooded state. So there's vibrant habitat for moose, black bear, bobcat, pretty much all the other big mammals and animals you can imagine across the state. I mean, I regularly run into them in southern New Hampshire in my research area, into moose and bear and all sorts of stuff. So the habitat's everywhere for possibly something that's maybe passing through or trying to get to a more heavily wooded area. Story I want to talk about is the Wood Devils. This is a story from Coos County. This is actually a sticker here that I have called Entering Coos County, Home of the Wood Devils. Now, this is a story that's very interesting. It's talked about in the North Country there for quite a bit, and it first came online in the early 2000s on some of the forums, and people talked about, well, the old timers talk about these wood devil creatures. They called them tall and hairy and gray, and you could almost walk into one before seeing it, and they let out these piercing screams at night. And a lot of people chalked it up to, well, it's just a story that came up as the internet was coming around. But I've actually spoken to people in an attempt to try and track down the origins of the Wood Devil story, who have said, no, I mean, in the 1970s, well before the internet, I heard that story from my grandparents. They would tell us, don't go too far in the woods or the wood devils will get you. And again, that goes back to that pre-sort of Bigfoot notion where people talk about, they try to relate it in other ways, talk about the Wildman or the gorillas and that sort of stuff. This is just a picture I took while hiking Mount Cabot when I stayed up there when I was doing my New Hampshire 48 a few years ago. Just a beautiful fall day. It's probably about 3-4 years ago now, almost to the date. You've got the Wood Devil IPA by 603 Brewing. I've never tried this one. I haven't been able to find it actually at the breweries, but it's kind of an homage to the Wood Devil story, which I think is pretty neat. This is a newspaper clipping from the Berlin area, which shows, hunters talking about seeing Bigfoots, and it's just really interesting. They had the descriptions, the artist renditions of what these two men saw separately, two different hunters. And again, those are guys that kind of spend a lot of time in the woods, and they're hunting for bear and moose and all these kinds of things, and they see something that is entirely different. It sort of throws them for a loop. This is a very interesting sighting. I actually just received this fairly recently. This is a newspaper clipping from the Boston Globe, which, believe it or not, talks about a gorilla that was seen in 1895 in Greenville, New Hampshire. And I'll read you the transcript here. I know it's a little grainy on the screen, but this is kind of the original clipping from newspapers.com, which is an archive service. You can look up old newspapers. So this is from Tuesday morning, October 22nd, 1895. Saw a gorilla. Greenville, New Hampshire residents frightened by a strange creature. The people of this section are excited over the rumor that a gorilla has been seen in the woods. Last Saturday, boys were out shooting squirrels. After firing, the boys were startled to see a great beast jump from the brush and disappear into the woods. Their story is vouched for by a reputable New Ipswich man. That evening, a young man who lives a short distance out of town, when near the Pleasant Street Cemetery, heard growling followed by a noise in the bush. He saw something and started for home as fast as his legs could carry him. On his arrival, there he fell prostrate on the floor from fright and exhaustion. A party of men with shotguns went in pursuit of the gorilla yesterday, but found no trace. An Ashby man informed the Globe correspondent that the gorilla was seen there a few evenings ago. So again, I mean, this is something that came about after the awareness of gorillas, which I think is just very interesting. And this actually, very interestingly enough, happens where this happened in Greenville, New Hampshire, is very close to a number of other modern reports of a Bigfoot-like creature, both east and west of there. Within, we're talking a town over. And so, I mean, what they were talking about, I don't know, but the type of report, you could replace gorilla with Bigfoot and say this happened in 2021, and it could almost be to a T. Many similar incidents happen across the country like this. So I just find that really fascinating. I found that out recently, actually, from a good friend of mine, author Michelle Soulier, who put out a fantastic book recently this past summer called Bigfoot in Maine. I highly recommend it if you're interested in this topic. She talked to many eyewitnesses and folks, loggers who waited 30 years to share their stories of seeing things in the North Maine woods. She did an impeccable job, and I definitely recommend it as a kind of, if you're interested in this topic and interested in the New England stories. This is a very fascinating story, the Stark POW gorilla story. Again, another gorilla story. This happened in Stark, New Hampshire, which during the Second World War, there was a prisoner of war camp there where they had German POWs. And I was actually told this story at a Granite State Bigfoot library talk. This is the last talk I gave, I believe, in person before the pandemic in January of 2020. And a woman approached me and said that either her father or uncle, I don't know the detail, I'm still trying to follow up with her. He was working at this camp, and they had these Germans there. There's actually a famous case of one of the Germans escaping and made it all the way to New York City before he was captured. There's been a book written about it, but this camp, they basically had the Germans up there. They had them on logging duty, and apparently at one point they complained they didn't want to go in the woods because they were seeing gorillas in the woods. So you're taking people who are completely unrelated to Coos County, to New Hampshire. They're prisoners of war brought there against their will, seeing gorillas in the woods. And why they would choose to make that up if they, for example, didn't want to be on logging duty, but they told the story of seeing gorillas and kind of freaked them out. And they were not aware of the Wood Devil story, of course. So very, very fascinating. The Hollis flea monster. This is a great story. This was in 1977 in Hollis, New Hampshire. Something I've followed up quite a bit, having lived near there in the past. Very interesting story of some kind of a creature that was seen on multiple occasions and described as shaking a camper at one point at the Hollis flea market, at which point the gentleman in his truck sleeping overnight waiting for the flea market the next day actually was from Lowell, Massachusetts. He was there with his sons and they were sleeping, and this creature shook the van and he went outside. And the two versions of the story I've heard were it either brushed his shoulder or he shined a flashlight at it and it stuck his tongue out at him, and it was this blondish, large 8-foot tall creature that smelled like rotting fish, and it freaked him out so bad that he sped out of town, went to the police station in Hollis, and went all the way back to Lowell, Massachusetts. And this is actually an original newspaper clipping from that, from the National Telegraph, talking about Lowell man sees, flees Hollis after seeing monster, and it's kind of a nickname, the Hollis flea monster. There was actually a Harvard anthropologist named Carlton Kuhn who was involved in the case. He administered polygraph or lie detector tests at the time with the man and his sons, and found that he believed their answers were satisfactory. Of course, polygraphs are now no longer permissible in a court of law, for example, but he was very intrigued, and he believed that this Bigfoot creature could be real based off of his investigation in that, but also talking to other anthropologists at the time. And this is kind of a depiction of that in the Granite State Bigfoot comic book that I mentioned earlier. Now, interesting 2021 update to this story. Upon releasing the Granite State Bigfoot case documentary on YouTube for Beyond the Trail, I received a lot of sightings based off of that. People talking about, whoa, I had this happen. And I was actually reached out to by a MUFON investigator. So that's the Mutual UFO Network. They're a very old organization featured in the X-Files and other media as well. They're kind of like the UFO group. But back at the time, there weren't really any Bigfoot research groups. And apparently this guy, he reached out to me, said, I was a MUFON investigator, and this Bigfoot case, at the time was kind of steered my way. Hey, you research weird stuff. Why don't you check this out? So basically what he told me was he investigated the event for 3 weeks. I'll just read it in the way he wrote it. I investigated this event for 3 weeks. I interviewed all parties involved, searched the area with night vision equipment, had hair samples tested. Conclusion was the primary witness at the Hollis flea market story was not credible. His story did not hold up to any scrutiny and lacked credibility and had no scientific basis. In fact, I concluded this witness story created a mass hysteria. So that was somebody that was on the ground. So that's entirely possible. I mean, you have these stories that maybe somebody was playing a prank and then it turned into this big thing and there was hysteria and everyone started having sightings of these things. And I think it's important, again, to follow up and be skeptical and always make sure, a lot of this anecdotal stuff can turn out this way, which is, just part of it. I think it's important to recognize that. The Bald Mountain Curiosity. This is probably one of my favorite New Hampshire related stories. And I actually had a chance to speak to this gentleman a few years ago, and he recounted his story to me. He didn't want to be recorded or really talk much about it, but apparently in 1979, he was hiking in the Ospey Range in Carroll County, New Hampshire, and came across this strange stone structure. He was with his girlfriend and their dog, and they were bushwhacking. There was no trails or anything. This place called Connor Pond, and came across this structure with a kind of, this is the area right where that happened, Bald Mountain in that area. And this is a depiction. He came across this structure made of stacked stones, with a hemlock roof, and this creature sitting inside with its back towards them. He didn't really know what it was. Their dog started growling at it, at which point this thing let out some sort of guttural noise, he said, that terrified them to the point where they basically booked it down the mountain. It wasn't until halfway down the mountain they realized they had a camera, but they were not brave enough to go back up there to take a picture, fortunately. It took him a year to get back up to that spot. And when he made it to that very spot, he said there was no trace of the structure. His girlfriend had found out a story at the Wolfboro Library of a man in the 1890s living on that pond who reported a dog got caught in the ice and saw this tall, hairy man-like creature come out of the woods and rescue the dog. I still haven't been able to find that story, which is a very interesting kind of occurrence. And I talked to the gentleman, and he was sincere. He didn't say it was Bigfoot. He said it was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I don't know what that thing was, but it was huge, very frightening. It had sort of matted hair. It looked like it was dirty, like it was definitely living in there. So I don't know what exactly it could have been, but very interesting. Now, when we talk about the Marlborough Monkey, now this is very interesting. This term was coined actually by John Horrigan, who will be doing a presentation, I believe, this Saturday for the Wilmington Library about lake monsters, Nessian, Lake Champlain, some other stuff. John's a good friend. He was a researcher who was in it basically before the internet. He got out of paranormal research when the internet came about. And this told a story of a couple in Marlborough, New Hampshire, having seen some sort of a creature, a small orangutan-like creature, playing kind of hide and seek with them in this quarry when they were out there. And it's sort of frightening. And since then, there's been a large cluster of sightings that have come out of there. A friend of mine, a New Hampshire native, Carrick St. Laurent, he has a great channel on YouTube called Crash Course Cryptozoology. Very smart guy. He actually grew up in New Hampshire as well and had an experience with some sort of strange creature while younger. And that's actually propelled him to study anthropology and archaeology and to learn more about human origins based on his experience. But he was out researching this area and had some sort of wood knocking experience. And wood knocks are commonly reported with the Sasquatch phenomenon. And that's actually a communication tool that chimps will use. They'll throw rocks at trees or knock on wood as a sort of if there's one creature that happens to be in a certain area, one chimp, and one maybe in a valley, that's how they kind of communicate. So Carrick was researching this area and had some wood knocks happen, didn't know anything about the Marlborough story, just thought it was interesting, posted that video analysis of the sounds he got, and had a family reach out to him that lived basically on that same street, said, we have this happen all the time at 3 a.m. during the summer with our windows open. Something will come by and start hitting trees with wood, and we'll go out there thinking, it's somebody messing with us, or neighbors are all elderly. Very odd. It keeps happening on and on and on. And since then, we've had a number of other sightings that have emerged kind of in a weird coincidental pattern. This is actually a sketch that I received from a lady who grew up in the area, who had a customer who told her that he was a delivery driver driving around late at night and had seen this creature. And, not everyone's an excellent artist, so of course it maybe looked a little humorous to somebody from the outside, but this is what the guy described seeing as he was crossing, this thing was crossing the road as he was making his deliveries. So pretty interesting. Carrick has done a wonderful documentary called The Marlborough Monkey, Legend of the Marlborough Monkey, which you can see on YouTube, and he's working on a second part as well, documenting a lot of the sightings. And there's a lot more than we have time to get into, a lot more of these eyewitness accounts from that area. I've actually even talked to people who live in other states now that talk about, well, when I used to live in Marlborough, we had things happening. And it's definitely an area we're trying to focus on because it's very fascinating. You've got great habitat for lots of large animals in that area. And it's actually, as opposed to say Colas County or up towards the White Mountains, there's more people out there. So with Sasquatch sightings, of course, you need people. For sightings of anything, you need there to be people to be able to see. You can have a huge number of animals, but if there's no one there to see it, it's kind of very, very interesting. So just something I wanted to bring up. Now, okay, this is a very interesting report. Maybe people that are into comic books might recognize this, but this is a report I received by email. Somebody had contacted me and said they snowball thrown at juggernaut Sasquatch ? And I'll get into why it's described that way. This was unspecified county, I believe Hillsborough County. I'm not sure though. It took place in 1988, where this, at the time, so about 12 years old, was with his sister. They were playing in the snow, and some kind of a strange creature walked out of the woods, and they thought it was basically somebody sort of playing a prank on them. And I'm going to read directly from the quote from the email. The height was not very tall, about 6 feet. However, the arms were massive for that height, and it was about as wide as a pallet at the shoulders. Very strange looking thing with not that much of a neck. I was into comics then, and its shape reminded me of a short juggernaut from Marvel Comics. No neck that I could see. If it had one, it was very stout. The arms went to about the knee as it was hunched or crouched. They looked longer, but I would estimate at about the knee. The legs were not very long, kind of stumpy and thick looking. I picked up a piece of hard snow and shouted at it something to the effect of, "Hey, quit playing around, jerk," hoping to elicit a response from a jokester in a big costume. I threw snow at it, and the snow chunk went over its right shoulder. After doing that, it kind of slightly crouched rather quickly, then turned side on and began walking in the same direction it initially was walking. It got to the side bank of the road and just fluidly hopped up over without breaking stride, and a few footfalls into the woods, and it was gone. I couldn't hear it walking anymore. It walked into the woods where there were no homes, just acres and acres of town forest. So again, this is an area where this witness lived in a pretty rural area. So very interesting kind of description. I mean, he actually threw something at it, again, thinking it was a joke. It's interesting how your mind might respond to something like this that is very unusual. How do you process it in that moment? This one is a great story, and I know we're cutting it close here a little bit with the time, because I will be showing a short film after this, about 15 minutes long, but bear with me here because I think this is very interesting. This was actually a story that was told to me by somebody who's become a friend of mine. I've gone hiking with him now. At the time, he was a young dad in 2003 and was camping at a campsite in the White Mountains. He said he wasn't able to sleep very well, but he was with the mother of his son, and they were sleeping in the tent. And at some point in the night, they could hear, water in the creek and everything. But at some point in the night, he saw it was a very bright and illuminated night, and something dragged, as he said, clearly a hand over the tent, sort of brushed it by, and he thought it was very unusual. Was it somebody kind of playing a trick on them, maybe other campers? But he said there weren't too many other campers in that camp. But then it kind of let out this guttural noise, which he said there's no way it could be human. He could feel the vibrations of that noise in his chest. And he didn't think much of it. He wasn't into Bigfoot, didn't know anything about it. And until years later, he was watching a program on the History Channel called Monster Quest, done by Doug Hychek, who's a fantastic researcher, of a story that happened to a biologist out in California named Mayanzinski, Dr. Mayanzinski. He was a biologist who had a similar experience happen, something kind of dragging its hand in the tent, and he actually poked it and felt it, and believed and saw one of these Sasquatch creatures, and that's what he believed it was. And it was at that point that this witness sort of thought, well, that's kind of what I experienced. And then through listening to other podcasts, had heard other witnesses talk about hearing a roar that they could feel vibrating in their chest, how powerful it was, almost, kind of monster-like, which I think was really interesting. And this is a very fascinating one as we're sort of winding down with the New Hampshire stories. I could go on all night. I mean, there's, as I mentioned with my database, there's so many different interesting reports, but this one I actually heard about just a few days ago. And this one is very fascinating because it happened in the town I went to high school in, Wilton, New Hampshire. In southern New Hampshire, something killed their dog. So this was actually a report that was sent to my friend, New Hampshire Sasquatch, the anonymous researcher. He immediately sent this to me because this, he knew I kind of was in that area at the time. And it's like, this is really interesting. I just got this email to me. And this is, I'll read kind of the quote from that. Back when I was 7 to 8 years old, I lived in the town of Wilton in southern New Hampshire. I lived on a farm located in McGettigan Road outside of town. I woke up one night to the sound of my dog barking viciously at the woods. My dog was usually a peaceful and quiet dog, all 70 pounds of mutt. My dog lived in the barn to keep the coyotes away from our livestock my father kept. Noticing how unusual this occurrence was, I grabbed my pea shooter and put on my dirty rain boots and went downstairs and out the door. I made it quarter of the way to the barn when I heard my father yell and come charging to the door with his buck rifle in hand. My father grabbed me by the arm and yanked me back with his rifle still pointed at the barn. Then we heard it. The dog had bitten down on the creature in the barn and it let out a roar of pain. It was so loud it sounded like a train. Then we heard a thud and a whimper. The dog soon enough came running towards us and its chain of the leash got pulled back. The creature ran out of the barn with my dog's chain in hand towards the woods. It was huge and black. The creature's eyes were glowing a sickly yellow color from the porch light on the house, and it looked at us quickly. Then all hell broke loose. The dog got pulled by the collar and flipped onto its back, and when being pulled at the same speed as the creature running. My father ended up firing 3 shots, but it didn't change anything as my dog was tumbling and screaming. It was hauled by its neck into the woods. The last glimpse of my dog was it catching onto the barbed wire fence as it yelped and then was pulled into the woods whining. My father went out with some neighbors the next day, but didn't find much. They said the dog likely bled out due to the blood they followed for a good half mile or so until they lost its trail. I was very sad for weeks after the occurrence. That's kind of the main events of that incident, which is very traumatic. And yeah, there are some Bigfoot reports where animals are stolen or maimed, especially dogs. It seems to be 50-50. Some reports describe people saying, these things don't mind their dogs, whereas there's been a couple other, another one of a dog that was killed on Mount Cabot by what a hiker lady described as a Sasquatch, and Fish and Game told her it was clearly a bear, and she was adamant about what had killed her dog, essentially. Very sad one, but very interesting nonetheless. And it happened either in 1973 or 1974. And again, this is the town that I went to high school in. So finding this out this week was pretty interesting. There's not a whole lot you can follow up on when a story is that old, unfortunately. So we make do with what we have when it comes to that. So just to highlight a few things as we're wrapping up here. Local research group I think is great, and especially given that this is a Massachusetts library, is Team Squatchachusetts, which is a fantastic research organization, very science orientated. They are based out of kind of central and western Mass, but they do expeditions in other parts of the state as well. Run by Jonathan Wilk, who's a fantastic researcher, former park ranger out in western Mass, who saw 2 of these creatures while on official park duty and basically avoided the area he saw these things in, and was told by a supervisor that they had a logbook going back to the 30s or so with strange sightings of these kinds of creatures out in this remote wooded area near Savoy in western Massachusetts. So they're great. They have a map here of some of the sightings they've received over the years. They're just one of the few groups in New England that's really has a larger presence, and I think does a fantastic job. And a great place to learn about Bigfoot and cryptozoology in general is the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine, run by Lauren Coleman. It's in a beautiful spot right in Portland near the river, emptying out into Casco Bay. But Lauren Coleman has been on TV, and he's written dozens and dozens of books about this topic as a sociologist and as a researcher. And he's actually opening a secondary kind of office, a secondary little museum up in Bangor, which I believe is opening this fall. So it's going to be kind of a satellite office, satellite museum of the Cryptozoology Museum. And the Granite State Bigfoot case. So this is the Beyond the Trail documentary I mentioned. We posted that in May, and it's already up to over 300,000 views on YouTube. And that's important because I think a lot of people might not be aware of these stories in a state like New Hampshire. So we're giving people the awareness. And, I say the view counts not to brag, but because I've received so many reports and people have emailed me after watching and saying, wow, I've experienced similar things, but I didn't think anybody else in the state had. I've talked to other research groups and they kind of blew me off or whatever. So I think that's important. And the documentary I'm about to show has actually been on YouTube as well for quite a while, since 2016, and it's gotten over 100,000 views. And same thing, since I posted it, I've received a ton of reports that way, whether people post a comment or the follow up with email. I even end up talking to some of them. It's just a great way to kind of gather data in any way that we can. And this is just a kind of poster for it. This was actually a selection of the 2017 Massachusetts Independent Film Festival. Now, this film was done in 2016. I've come a long way since then, filmmaking wise. So, I'm obviously a little bit critical of my own work, but hopefully you guys will enjoy it. And with that said, if anyone wants to reach out, petakovmedia.com, that's the best place. I have, lots of, stuff on there. You can check out links to all the films and everything, and you can email me. I've got a shop on there as well. We sell the Granite State Bigfoot comic book. I have the Wood Devil stickers. I have a lot of DVDs and that sort of stuff if you want to help support this kind of research. So with that said, I think what we'll do now is transition to the, if I stop sharing the screen, let's see, I can put in the film now. So just bear with me here for a second, folks. Share screen. The film is about 15 minutes. So I think once we wrap up with that, we can take a few questions. I know that there's going to be a little bit of time for some questions. So let me just see if I can get this to open now. Alrighty. Oh, What is going on? I'm terrible at using Zoom, so I apologize. Okay, there we go. Share screen. QuickTime Player. All right, so here is the film, folks. And hopefully everyone can see it okay. And I will now hit play.
My name is Michael Eastman. I live in Berlin, New Hampshire. I'm retired now, was a artist, painter, and owned a business here in town for many years, about 21 years. And then prior to that, I was in the military for 4 years. And this is my hometown where I live. Many years ago, I went back to the people, Abenaki. As far as how I live my life today, a lot of it is founded on those very basic principles. And of course, for the purposes of this topic, I approach it from that angle, more of a cultural angle than anything else. Rather than call them Sasquatch for the sake of retaining our language, I refer to them as Shy Man or Tsatsipopa. I saw the very first one I saw up at the lake, up at Umbagog, or Wombagok, back in 1973, and I was sleeping out on the porch. It came walking through the woods. I could hear it, and as I laid there listening, I had taken off my glasses and put them on the sofa that I was sleeping on, and so they were above my head. I could hear it snapping off spruce tines and that kind of thing. But then it got really quiet, and as I laid there, and I wasn't really concerned about anything, and as I laid there, I was by myself. As I laid there, I smelled something, and it was a very heavy odor. Reminded me very similar to a monkey house kind of smell with almost a diesel, very unpleasant. And then I heard a sound on the screen, and I looked over. I hadn't put my glasses on. I was expecting to see maybe a big moth or something like that. And as I looked over, there was just this massive being standing there staring at me. It was huge, and it was the first time in my life, and I've done a lot of really crazy stuff in my lifetime, and it was the one time in my life where I literally hyperventilated. I couldn't catch my breath, I couldn't speak, and I literally could not move. I just laid there hyperventilating. It walked to the side of the camp where the door was. It pressed on it, and but it left and walked down to the lake, and it walked into the water. I sat up, I put my glasses on, and I just sat there on the couch looking at this thing, and it went over to the motor boat and played around with the motor a little, and then walked off into the, there's an area that like a wetland, and went into there. So that was my That was my first experience and actually the most terrifying. Then this past, in 2015, I saw a number of them. I decided to go out and do some research on Shy Man. And in large part, the foundation of the research was that I wanted to prove that they're there so that in fact, because I think they deserve the same treatment as any other rare species that may be running about in our forests. So I went into the research with the hopes of getting legislation passed to protect them both from hunting and trapping. And so I went to an area where I knew that there was a family group of them. I'd found their area several years ago. I wound up calling it Wollagok so that I would not give away the location in discussing it with anyone. And I went in and spent the next 9 months going in roughly almost every day to observe and research and collect as much information as I possibly could. This is the track that I poured out there. It's of a younger one, but you can see the instep here. This is a left foot, and you can see the instep, the big toe, and then the other 2 digits. You can't see them only because it was on an incline, and it stepped on the instep. This is the hair that I took off from a tree. It was roughly about 7 feet up, and while I never saw any porcupine activity in that area, I can't totally negate it either. So until such time as I can get it tested, I'll just have to assume that it is porcupine hair, but it came from right there where they were, where I was doing my research. Now, when you look at this one here, if you look very closely, you can see that there are teeth marks on it. To look on the back, they appear to be relatively flat. This is my fake rock that I had built to put a camera in, and I put a lens on it to make it look like there was a lens. What I had done was I would go out to Wollagok and I would pull this apart because I wanted them to see me messing with it all the time, so that when I actually put in a camera, I was hoping that they wouldn't, they wouldn't be bothered by it. And you can see where the pulled out, but they also peeled at it trying to open it. And then they knew that something had to be done on this side. This is the equipment that I've been using. It's just a little audio recorder. It's really basic, which I like because you can't manipulate it. But what I would do is I would take this, turn it on, slide it into a sleeve, and I could either pull these out and stick it in a rock, or I could tack it to a tree and just hope that I remember where I stuck it. Alright, so this first sound is Shy Man's traditional language. It's a click-pop language, and here you go. This next sound is like a bellowing kind of sound. It has somewhat of a metallic nature to it. I don't know, again, I don't know why, but this is what goes on out there at night. also have one recording where they have an exchange that isn't quite so friendly. When I went into this, I wanted to approach them because I felt if I approached them in a way that was reminiscent of how we used to act 600 years ago, I thought, well, I'll go in and I'll speak to them in Abenaki, but beyond that, I couldn't help but wonder whether they would respond to that or not. So what I did was, back a long time ago when we went into somebody else's area, we would bring tribute, and you would leave that or gift it to the individual who controlled that particular piece of turf. So I entered that area that way, and they responded. They're not the animal, if I can put it that way, that I thought they were. They personally, to me, after having spent a fair amount of time around them and them around me, in some instances 30 feet away maybe, they stayed behind glacial erratics and blowdowns and things like that. But I could hear them click-plopping, talking to one another in their own language. They are very family-orientated. They have family groups. I believe that they possibly have clans that communicate with each other, seeing where it is that they live, what the terrain is, and what features, stick structures, all these other things, breaks, bends. I've found that some of the things that they make are very similar to what our people did culturally. And so I find that there's almost this indigenous tribal kind of thing going on. And I have not proven this yet, but I hope to in the years that follow. I think that everybody is getting these little tiny pieces and they're plopping them in. And through all these various means, I think that someday we will discover what these beings really are, what they represent, what they reflect. But the one thing that I do know, and I see expressed in the forest from time to time, we're impacting them in a big way, and that's why they need to be protected. It's just a matter of time. We have 1,000 miles of ATV trails now, and snow machine trails, etc. We have windmills popping up everywhere. We have all these things that we do as human beings that are impacting their environment in a very big way. And I think that this is something that I would encourage other researchers to do as well. As I'm not saying don't go out at night, because if that's your gig, it's your gig. Have fun. But I would also say maybe try going out and getting out there in daylight hours so that you can see their influences in the forest around you, because they do. Some of it is so subtle that the average person is not even going to notice, but that's the other thing. If we all start becoming very aware, do I think that there's the potential for that moment where we all sit there and we go, wow. Yeah, I do. I really do.
Okay, so there you have it. That is the end of the film there. So if we have a few minutes left, as I think we do, if anyone wants to come up and ask any questions or anything like that.
Alexander, we actually do have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
It says, this was from a little while ago, it said some of these reports go back 100 plus years. Assuming Bigfoots live to be 65 or so years, how do they keep making new Bigfoots? Is there a whole society of Bigfoots propagating the species? If so, how is it possible we haven't found remains or seen more of them?
It's a good question. Yeah, absolutely. Now, when it comes to the sightings, I think they're numerous in the many thousands. I mean, if you look at, not only we're talking about those cultural reports from predating the modern Bigfoot era, but again, you need people to have sightings. So in a lot of these remote areas, you don't really have people, but there are enough sightings. I mean, there's hundreds of sightings every single year. Not all of them are credible, as I mentioned. Of course, you have to weed out ones that are definitely more reliable than others. But a great example, and as I pointed to earlier, is the Giganopithecus, which is the largest ape in history, bar none. I mean, this thing is the literal inspiration for King Kong. We now believe it was probably a relative of the orangutan, but it was upwards of 10 feet tall, massive, massive creature. And the only fossil evidence we have that it exists is teeth bones and jaws. And those were found accidentally in Chinese apothecary shops because, a lot of these, for Chinese traditional medicine, they would go and find dragon bones. And that involved getting fossils they found in caves. And there's actually porcupines that eat those bones. So it's believed that a lot of the porcupine, or a lot of the Giganopithecus bones, are probably have been disintegrated or eating. Also, North America is notoriously bad for fossil preservation, especially the areas where the reports come from. So forested areas that are high in rain and acidity, as opposed to, you have places like Dinosaur Valley in Utah and Colorado. Now, those are desert environments where, of course, you can kind of dig back the layers, but fossil remains are very difficult to find in other parts of the country. And I think there has not been any serious looking into Bigfoot bones. This kind of stuff takes a lot of money. So, I mean, is there any university or governmental organization that's willing to maybe put $10 million into trying to excavate Bigfoot bones? Probably not anytime soon, unless there's something. So I don't think it's even really been looked at seriously, unfortunately.
We have another question. What do you think of the reality Bigfoot shows that are out there on TV?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and I think unfortunately most of them are bogus, as most of the stuff on TV is. I will say Finding Bigfoot is a show that most people will know, and I know a lot of the cast members actually in that show, and they're great researchers. They are Bigfooters. They've been Bigfooting from way before them when they were put on TV, and that show, what it did was actually they had 9 seasons basically, and went to different parts of the country. They went to different states. That show has done more for kind of spreading awareness for the topic than any other documentary before that. It gave people in parts of the country that have had sightings the idea to say, well, hey, maybe these things are around here. I don't have to keep my sighting kind of in, like a lot of the cases here in New England. So that's the one show I think that a lot of people will joke, oh, they never found it. But I think culturally it created an atmosphere where it not only popularized the topic, but it also created more of an awareness. So on the one hand, TV is not usually very credible, but it used to be. There used to be great documentaries, In Search Of and back in the day, and even Monster Quest a couple decades ago. But most of the stuff now, we've had this change in TV programming in the mid 2000s where reality TV took over, and majority of anything on reality TV, unfortunately, is just not great.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Please type them in the chat box. We'll just wait a second here and see if there's any more. So in the meantime, thank you so much, Alexander. Really appreciate the presentation. And who knew? I wasn't, I grew up in California, so I've heard of Bigfoot and was certainly aware of the story, but I didn't realize that there had been so many sightings I just didn't realize there'd been so many sightings. So it's very interesting. So thank you. There's a thank you. So I think at that point, I think we've answered the questions. Really appreciate your time, and thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.